Hey guys, Anders here. Welcome back to another video. In today's video, we have a podcast that happened very recently with a former EA employee named Jim Heil. Jim Heil was brought on to Battlefield 2042 very late in its development. He claims to be brought on as late as May of 2021, and if you remember, the game released in November 12th, 2021 to be that specific. And Jim was a rendering engineer slash performance guy that was brought on to essentially try to solve some problems. And in this podcast, he unveils some crazy details about Battlefield 2042 that really shed light on where this game was prior to release, what the problems were, and just how much of a shit show things were. And honestly, still are. And I really can't believe that this podcast really even happened, or that Jim was even as candid as he was with some of the questions and discussions that were taking place. Jim also says during the podcast that he is not a part of, Criterion or DICE. EA brought him on specifically before the game released to try to solve some problems. So, as always, if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to watch, or listen to, rather, the entire podcast, it will be linked in the description. Thanks to Drawcall for this podcast, because this really sheds light on a ton of stuff. So the first thing I want to touch on in this podcast is the fact that Jim was brought on to look at some performance issues. And Criterion, which has done games like, Need for Speed and all that, actually created the vehicle models and just the way they work for Battlefield 2042. He claims that they actually, quote, ran well, which means that they performed well in-game, the vehicles themselves. But he also claims that the UI was drastically over budget, laughably so. For some reason, the UI in Battlefield 2042 was just giving them a ton of problems, and I think we can actually see the existing effects of that in the actual release product. On top of that, the UI indicator above the vehicles, the little symbol that tells you if it's a tank, apparently that little UI symbol cost the same amount of performance as the entire vehicle. And this section of the podcast is pretty funny because he's describing how he has to try to write in this email to people and describe how the icon is costing as much performance as the vehicle itself. But it's funny because he also says that they thought they had a vehicle problem on their hands. They thought the vehicles themselves were causing the performance issues, not the actual icon above the vehicle. So they didn't even know. But when he informed them of that, he said it called on a, quote, SWAT team of people, basically, to work on the UI to try to put out all these little separate fires, and that caused utter chaos. And then Jim kind of segues this into talking about how he was working on facial animation and the developers deciding, how can we make this work with how many people in the server? What distance do people need to see the facial animation of the characters? And he said that they didn't even get facial animation stuff to work until post-alpha. Like, the basic fundamental system and of how it works in the game wasn't working like 4 months before release at all. Then, in my opinion, one of the most interesting portions of this entire podcast is when he starts talking more deeply about some of the decisions they made prior to release with performance. Jim says it was very difficult to actually optimize this game to run well, and in my opinion, they still didn't do a great job of that. But from what this guy is saying right now about how much of a shit show it was really behind the scenes, I can't even believe that the game even released. But he was talking about how they decided, meaning DICE and EA, decided to have the game have a graphics system called TAA. It's the anti-aliasing. And the problem with the anti-aliasing that they ended up selecting is apparently this type of anti-aliasing forced the game to re-render stuff based on their motion vectors, as he says, or just motion in general. And he said that they didn't understand how much stuff was like that in Battlefield, because they have dynamic weather, they have all this stuff. So you're telling me that a tornado comes in and now you have hundreds of palm trees, or like 25 palm trees that you now have to constantly re-render their motion for? That is just performance sapping. And he said all of this stuff adds up to just almost an unmanageable point. And the real kicker is, apparently in the Slack channel, which is, I assume this is a Discord channel meant for like internal communication or something, there was apparently 300 people in the rendering section of this channel alone, including high-level producers and directors and all these people. But there's just a ton of eyes on this one thing, performance and rendering, and the game still doesn't run well. Then Jim goes on to describe how the entire internal situation of the game had its own gravity. So many people, including himself, got roped in, pulled in from other things. This game is on a 24-hour development cycle because it's Battlefield going into the holiday season. Basically, they're freaking out. So you have DICE LA working on things, which is now Ripple Effect. DICE Sweden, you have Criterion. All of these things on a 24-hour development scale, you're working on a bug for your shift. Oh, you can't fix it, you hand it off to another studio. That bug gets handed off to another studio. Maybe that bug makes it all the way back to you until it's finally fixed. I mean, it just sounds like a total chaotic mess leading up to this game's release. And then on top of everything else that Jim already described, he now talks about Frostbite and how Frostbite had a new version for Battlefield 2042 and that there are simply just problems with Frostbite that are not present in other engines. In other engines, you don't have to worry about some things that you have to worry about while working on Frostbite. It's just an incredibly difficult engine to work with, and this echoes the same things we heard a while ago with Battlefield 5 with the glass door reviews. The exact same thing was mentioned about even the prior version of Frostbite that is extremely difficult to work with, and there are problems that you simply don't have to worry about in other game engines. He briefly touches on Unreal and Unity, but he doesn't go into further detail as far as why they're easier to work with or anything like that. But yeah, this really does just illustrate how much of a shit show this game was even months before the game released. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I'll be posting content regularly about Modern Warfare 2. I'll be continuing to cover Battlefield 2042. And if you would like to listen to the full podcast, there's so much more that I couldn't fit in this video that I wanted to. Go listen to the full podcast in the description. I'm not affiliated with them in any way. I just think that this is very interesting. And if you want to listen to the entire hour-long thing, it's right there for you and it's free. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one.